Thank you very much for coming. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and learn a little something about Europe, uh, or at least the European Union, and gender and generations. I'm N.Cohen. I'm a sociologist at the University of Maryland. I will be your presider, facilitator for this session. We're going to have 4 panelists. Each will take in the neighborhood of 20 minutes, after which we will have time for reflection and continued conversation. So I will begin with Pearl Dykstra, our first speaker. Pearl Dykstra was chair of empirical sociology at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Previously, she had a chair in kinship demography at Utrecht University and was a senior scientist at the Netherlands Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute in The Hague. She's a specialist on intergenerational solidarity, aging, society's family change, aging in the life course, and loneliness. Her large-scale projects include the Netherlands Kinship Panel Study, the EU 7th Framework Program Multilinks, and she has received a grant for a new project on families in context, which focuses on how policy, economic, and cultural context structure intergenerational and gendered dependencies in families. We're very glad to have her here, and we'll start with Pearl Dykstra.
Well, thanks for this gracious introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Very interesting group. Great to see the graduate students and the undergraduate students, and great to have a place where we can talk to one another and exchange ideas. Philip, I'm going to be talking about generations as family generations, so you're getting what you asked for. What I'm trying to do is, I think, try and show where I am at my research right now. And I believe strongly in adopting, as the slide says, a multi-generational focus. So yes, I'm looking at vertical ties, grandparents, grandchildren, children, children, great-grandparents. I'm also looking at several generations together because, and I think it was Myra who said that in her introduction, it is demographic reality. And look what I have here. This is a picture or a link that was sent to me by one of my brothers. 6 generations in Ontario. All women had their babies at around the age of 17. So yes, that's how you can easily get 6 generations. It's a little video, and the mothers talk about themselves, about how close, tight their family is and how great it is to have a baby at a young age. But believe me, 6 generations is not the norm. Most adults are part of 3-generation families. But still, the fact that most of us are part of 3-generation families is new. Demographic reality, but another thing I want to talk about, and I know Myra said, let's see if we can think outside the box. When we think about families, we tend to think of the young faces of families, mummies and daddies with kids at home. And what I'm trying to do is kind of extend that focus. Think of multiple generations. Think of what adult children do for their parents and what grandparents do for their children and for their grandchildren. So I'm trying to get us to look at all phases of life. And I'm having some difficulty. I'm used to working with a different kind of mouse. So this is, thank you. This is a picture that I took at a graduation, a BA graduation. And yes, some of the students had their own kids, but they'd also brought their grandparents. Thank you for appreciating it. Okay, so one message I want to bring across is multiple generations. Another is a comparative focus. And when I talk about a comparative focus, I talk about cross-national differences in Europe. And I also try and look at the historical context. And if I've got enough time, I'm going to try and see if I can illustrate both. And in doing that, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to connect 2 strands of life course literature. It's very interesting that there's two kinds of life course literatures. This is a broad generalization, but there is some truth to it. The body of research that's been developed in the United States, and then there's a body of research that's been developed in Europe. And in the United States, there's much more emphasis on agency. And if they talk about context, they talk about linked lives, the extent to which the way one's life unfolds is influenced by others who are close to us, or that if you take a decision, you take the situation of others into account. That's the notion of linked lives. Whereas what the Europeans have been looking at much more strongly is the extent to which how our lives unfold is influenced by the greater context. Think of the welfare state, think of economic circumstances, think of cultural circumstances. And what I'm trying to do with my focus on families, I'm trying to bring together these two bodies of literature, so the linked lives and the lives in context. And I'm doing that by using the concept of generational interdependence. And what I mean by that is the extent to which in our lives we are dependent, or our lives are structured by the intergenerational chain of which we are a part, or we might not be a part. Think of childlessness. I've done a lot of research on childlessness. Or think of gendered interdependence. And the gendered interdependence is, again, if we're thinking of care for the young and care for the old, that's a different kind of interdependence. What I said is I'm going to try and bring you some examples from research, and I'm providing references for those who are interested. You never know. And not necessarily, most of it isn't even my own research. This is research from Jan van Bavel, who's at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and Philip de Winter, who's at the University of Brussels. And what they did, what I'm trying to show now is that if you adopt a multi-generational view, you can come up with new questions and new insights. What they did here is they looked at the age of retirement, exit from the labor force, and they looked at the extent to which people retire early. Of course, only in those countries that allow early retirement. Data from the European Social Survey, so they cover something like 27 European countries. And what do we see? We see that, yes, there's a tendency towards early retirement, but that those who are grandparents, and those are the general, I can use this. Yes. How does this work? Help me. Yes. Okay. This little circle is the average. Yeah. And then you see that women are more likely, so there's a greater likelihood that they're leaving earlier. For men, there's something of a greater likelihood that they're leaving earlier, but you also see that there's much more variation around that average. So what we find in this, or what they found, is that those who are grandparents are more likely to leave the labor force early. And don't forget, people looking at exit from the labor force have never considered the idea. Yes, they've considered the idea of looking at a marital partner, they've looked at health, they've looked at labor force conditions, but they never thought of looking at, hey, some of these old people might want to leave early because they want to take care of their grandchildren or spend time with their grandchildren. An example of a new insight that you might get from adopting a multi-generational view. This is another example, and this is a study by Wing Chan and Vicky Bolivar. Wing Chan's at the University of Oxford, Department of Sociology. And what they did is, again, they took a three-generation view. What's typical in sociology is just where people end up is it's very strongly determined by what your daddy and your mummy did. What they did is they wanted to see, well, hey, how is where you end up in life? Yes, that's strongly determined by your mom and by your dad, but they went one generation back. And they found a really strong association between where your grandparents, their social status, and actually they took the maternal grandparents for all kinds of reasons that I'm not going into now, and where you ended up. And they found that a particularly strong association existed in the cases of what they called upward counter mobility. So those parents who had actually experienced some downward mobility. If you look at their children, they experienced rather strong upward mobility again, as if these grandparents were correcting the class position. And they argue that this is a real effect and that's not to be seen as regression towards the mean. And this kind of study can be done with these wonderful British data, the cohort studies. Another study this is done by Dutch people who are at the university, the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. Rather unique data from 1992 and 2002, where they took old people, grandparents, and they have questions or information on all of the grandchildren. But they also looked at whether the grandparents looked after the grandchildren. And 8 years later, they came back, and what did they find? That in cases where the grandparents had been helping out the parents were more likely to go on to have a second or a third or a fourth child. And they use this cooperative breeding hypothesis to understand it. But here again, it's a new insight in fertility. Yes, the fact that parents help out the middle generation enables them to go on to have a second or a third or a fourth child. Again, examples of research, new ideas that come from taking a multi-generational view of families. Now I want to look at what I called macro-level structuring of a generational interdependence. Here, a very simple graph. It's produced by Maria Iacovu. I'm not sure where she is. She's somewhere in the United Kingdom. And it shows the proportion of older adults who live with their adult children. It's very important to note that it's not, you don't think that these old people have gone to live with their children. No, it's a graph of the middle generation continuing to live with the older generation. And studies on household exchanges show that what's happening in these households is that the middle generation, or these kids, are being helped out. And a lot of them are 40 and 50. And don't think that these are households where the old people are being taken care of. But what do we see? We see enormous differences across Europe. For you, your left, you see the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, France, very low levels of intergenerational living together, and very high levels in Spain, in Latvia, in Hungary, Poland. And of course, this graph doesn't tell us why the levels are much higher there in those other countries. And it's a mixture of housing, the fact that in Italy, for example, in Spain, there are very few affordable apartments for young people. It has everything to do with the incomes that young people have. In Italy, starting wages are very low, so you cannot afford to live on your own. There's possibly some culture too. There's a suggestion that the Italians will go through great efforts to keep their children at home. A lot has to do, if you talk to Eastern European colleagues, they will say it's hidden poverty. Old people can't afford to live alone, and the young people can't afford to live alone. But here we see very strong, at least for me, it's an example of how economic policy, housing circumstance structure something simple like a living arrangement. Another slide, this is a bit more complicated, and Chiara, I think, will be happy to see it because it's from a project that we were involved in together called Multilinks. First look at the y-axis, it's called services, and the x-axis is effective leave. What Chiara did with 2 graduate students is that she harmonized all kinds of childcare services. So the measure here, the services, is the proportion of daycare spots for 0 to 3-year-olds, and the effective leave is a measure in which she took into account the number of weeks of leave, but also how well it's paid. Look at the Czech Republic. Czech Republic is interesting because it scores very highly on this effective leave. So parents get long maternity leaves and they're also well paid. Look on the other extreme at Belgium. Belgium scores very highly on services. So Belgium has a lot of places for children in daycare. Now go for the size of the circle. And the larger the size of the circle, the more likely it is that grandparents care daily for the child of a working daughter. And where are the circles very big? In Italy, in Greece, in Spain, and in Poland. And why are they very big there? Grandparents are helping out daily because there's very little effective leave, and there's also very limited childcare services. The Netherlands, as you will see, and I'm sorry I'm repeating myself, is also in that quadrant of poor services, poor effective leave, but it has a tiny wee little circle. Why? Grandparents are not likely to provide daily care for their grandchildren. And why? Because women are not working. But that's, again, here we can think of generational interdependence, the extent to which grandparents have to, or the middle generation has to rely on their parents if they want to continue working. So here's an example of structuring of intergenerational relationships as a result of the kinds of family policies that are available in various European countries. Is that clear? Okay. Two more graphs. Now we're looking at what adult children do for their aging parents. This is work of Martina Brunt, who's at the University of Mannheim. She's very involved in the SHARE, which is the Survey of Health and Aging and Retirement in Europe, which it's modeled on the Health and Retirement Survey of the United States. What we see is, I drew a very clear line. It's the proportion of adult children providing help to elderly parents, and help, think in terms of transportation, cooking, gardening, day-to-day activities that do not require regular help or being there regularly. And where are adult children most likely to do this? You see that's in Denmark and Sweden and Netherlands and the Belgium. That's that upper right-hand quadrant. And what characterizes those countries? Those are countries where there's a large proportion of people in the labor force who are working in an OECD category called care and welfare. So in countries where not many people are working in care and welfare, Greece, Spain, Italy, Austria, we see that adult children are least likely to be providing this day-to-day help to their parents. Now comes the next slide. We're not talking help now, but we're talking care. And what is care? Care is nursing. Care is helping old parents get to bed, feeding them, helping them go to the washroom, undressing, dressing. And you will see that the line is opposite to what it was previously. You also see that the top, if you go to the y-axis, you see that in Denmark, for example, 40% of adult children are providing help to parents. Look here, the provision of care, it's much less likely, fortunately, because it's not as necessary. But where do we see that people are providing most care, adult children providing most care? It's the countries where there's the lowest proportion of people are working in care and welfare. So here, why are in Greece, Italy, and Spain and Austria relatively high proportions of adult children helping out their parents? It's because, again, they have to, because there are few public and market positions that take up the care for old people. Again, a form of structuring of generational interdependence given by policies. How much time do I have, Philip? Okay. Then what I can't do, and this is an example of my own research, but I'll quickly tell you what. I mean, this is fun. Okay. Divorce research. And here I want to show something of historical change. And I know divorce is of interest to a lot of people. There's this general idea that the effects of divorce on children or effects of divorce on people will have declined over time. Why? Less stigma. It's easier to divorce, so the marriages ending in divorce are not as terrible as they were previously. People are better prepared. We know about divorce. And there's this whole industry of practitioners and people working, helping out the divorced and the children of divorce. And Michael Wagner, who's at the University of Cologne, has called this divorce culture. Cartoons showing divorce culture. Can you read this? I want to get married and start a family with you, although God knows who I'll want to finish it with. Okay, forget about this slide. The message here is, even though we have really good ideas to think that the impact of divorce on children will have changed and declined over time, there's very little evidence. So I started to think how this could be possible. And what it struck me here is I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but that we call this the educational gradient, that those who end up divorcing are nowadays a different group than previously. Again, we're talking Europe, because in Europe we're now getting the pattern that has been common for the United States for a very long time. Previously in Europe, you had higher rates of divorce among the well-educated. Why? They could face the stigma, they had money, they had access to lawyers, blah, blah, blah. But since the 1980s, 1990s, what we see is that the well-educated are least likely to divorce, and that it's the more poorly educated who are more likely to divorce. The pattern has been like that always in the United States. And so I was thinking, well, what we might find here is, why aren't we finding any effects? Because we've got opposing tendencies. One is what I call the selectivity hypothesis, is that if the highly educated, if their marriages end, they have to be really, really bad marriages, because they have a high barrier to divorce. And they also tend to have better marriages. So I called that the selectivity hypothesis, which would say, well, yes, the kids of well-educated parents are really going to suffer if their parents divorce. And the other was the protection hypothesis, and that is that the highly educated are better able to protect their children. I don't think I have time to tell you how I did this. I used a wonderful British data set, the British Youth Panel Study. The only message is, what did we find? We found no evidence for the selectivity hypothesis. I don't have time. But we do have evidence for the protection hypothesis. My basic argument, and this is where we get into women and into gender, is that women, highly educated women, are better able to protect their children from the negative effects of divorce than are poorly educated women. So it helps to educate women. And if they go through a divorce, they can protect their children from suffering adverse effects. So that's my message. Let's try to avoid a chopped up notion. I think that's important in policies too, that we try to think of families over the entire life course. I think it's important to look at macro level structuring of family practices. I always think it's important to look at historical changes. And I think that trying to combine this notion of linked lives and lives in context, that we can make scientific progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pearl. Our next presenter will be Kimberly Morgan, an expert in politics and social policy in the U.S. and Western Europe. Her book Recent book is Working Mothers and the Welfare State, Religion and the Politics of Work-Family Policy in Western Europe and the United States from Stanford University Press. That's basically all she wanted me to say. This is what she works on, and she works at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and we're delighted to have her here. Thank you.
Thank you for the brief introduction, which I requested. I don't have a PowerPoint. My students tell me I'm really bad at PowerPoint, so I finally have given it up for academic presentations in particular, to spare everyone in the room. So thank you for this opportunity, for inviting me here and the chance to put forward some, I will admit at the outset, some loosely developed ideas I have with regard to labor migration. My recent research has been about labor migration to Europe in the post-World War II decades. And I'm hoping that what I've been studying has some relevance for the topic of this conference about gender and generations. And I think it does, because the demographic challenges facing rich democracies that we've been hearing about and heard about at lunch, one response to these challenges may lie in greater migration. And certainly there's been a lot of feminist attention and scholarship on the role that migrant labor has played in supplying care and other kinds of household assistance for aging societies, with old age care in particular being a very important source for this form of migrant labor. But that more broadly, societies with aging populations could call upon more labor migration, given the demand for labor that is likely to exist in the future. The OECD, for instance, in their various reports on the topic, forecast the need for labor of quite varying skill levels, both high skill, that's what you often tend to associate with the debates in Europe these days about the need for more labor, but also low skill, medium skill. The OECD forecasts a need for lots of different forms of labor, and they think that migration may be one way to go about getting more of that. So I think we need to start to think about this now. When I first started studying family policy, it was always a sort of, in the future, we will be aging societies. Well, we already are. Many countries are starting down this road of demographic decline. Thus, I think we need to confront the question of migration and how to regulate it, what contribution it could make, if any, to questions of demographic sustainability, and what implications that might hold for politics, for gender relations, and for social justice concerns. Now, I will not attempt to answer all of these questions in this presentation, but what I will try to do nonetheless, which I still think is too much, is offer a few lessons from the experience of Western European countries after 1945 with labor migration. I will then, with an interest in particular on the guest worker and post-colonial migrations from about 1945 until the mid-1970s. Then I'll talk about some of the current social and political conflicts that have resulted from this very significant migratory wave. And then in light of those two things, think about what future possibilities there might be for labor migration in light of both the past and the present. So I think when you look back at the history of labor migration after World War II, it's a pretty well-known story, in a sense, that the post-war years until about the mid-1970s, there was a quite massive migratory wave to Western Europe, fueled by an economic boom and resulting labor shortages. And in this situation, labor migration seemed like an expedient solution, a way to attain economic growth while holding down inflation. And in particular, to draw in a labor force willing to do some of the worst work that had to be done. Thus, the result was an influx of people, largely men, and specifically men, because that's who was wanted, coming out of either guest worker programs or various forms of post-colonial migration coming from parts of the world that had previously been colonized. Thus, people initially from Southern Europe, but then increasingly from other countries in North Africa, Turkey, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, depending on which country you're looking at. On the one hand, there were formal guest worker programs that were supposed to regulate this migration, but much of it in reality was what is often referred to as spontaneous. And what that really means is that state authorities looked the other way and did so quite willingly, often regularizing these immigrants after the fact. And I think it's pretty clear that states did not seriously try or simply failed to regulate the inflows of labor that were coming to Europe in this period. They then hastily tried to close the door on migration by the mid-1970s owing to the oil shocks and the recession in Europe, stopping formal labor migration, but then people continued to come. They came through family reunification rights, through the asylum-seeking door, and also then unauthorized migration of various kinds, creating the so-called immigration problem that seems to have be plaguing Europe ever since. And I'll just note here briefly that the temporal sequence I'm describing here is really about certain European countries, particularly Northern European countries. Britain is a bit different because immigration was stopped in the mid-1960s. Southern Europe, Ireland, these were countries of emigration that came to immigration later, more like in the 1990s. And also, I think another sort of story that could be told could be about European integration and its impact, of course, on migration, with in particular huge flows of people coming from Eastern Europe in the 1990s and especially the 2000s, going in particular to Germany and the UK and so on. So there's different flows that one could discuss, and the story that I'm really more focused on for purposes of simplicity and being able to keep within a time limit is that of this wave of people who came in the 3 decades after the Second World War. So what are some of the lessons of this past labor migration? Well, the usual one that people would put forward is a sort of immediate policy lesson, which would say that guest worker programs and labor migration policy in general does not work. Because these guests they will overstay their welcome. They will not leave. At least a certain number of them will stay. And the result then, well, is that they will draw in other people through chain migration, as it's called. Families will join them, taking advantage of the right to family life that is protected in European law and domestic law in a variety of places. And thus, from a cost-benefit standpoint of a policymaker, what might start out as a cost-effective way to solve economic problems, to draw in these single men who weren't supposed to stay and were not supposed to use a lot of social services and were supposed to go home, in the long run, their families will come. And when the families come, you will have education costs, you will have housing costs, you have all kinds of social costs and cultural costs, because they will come, they will be different, they will cause conflict over the fact that they are very different from the societies that they have moved to. And when children and families come along, all kinds of cultural conflicts then follow. Thus, the usual policymaker conclusion would be that circular migration policies of the kind envisioned after 1945 by organizations like the OECD, and by various policy thinkers of the time, guest worker programs, they don't work, and so we shouldn't even consider doing them, unless we're willing to countenance the reality that we will become more diverse societies with permanent migration. So politically, this is then a sort of non-starter. But I think there's other lessons one could draw. One lesson could be to reflect upon just how important post-war labor migration was in sustaining a particular economic, social, and gender order. The economic point often made is about how cheap and flexible and exploitable labor contributed to the boom, at least according to a number of economists, that it was quite significant. But the social and gender order of the decades after the Second World War that we're hearing Jeff Ely talk about this morning also depended on these exploited and exploitable men as well. That in fact the male breadwinner model hinged in part on the presence of this low-wage workforce, which moved into doing all the kinds of work that native labor had to do previously, enabled working class women to not have to do a lot of this kind of work, and thus with rising wages for working class men, they were able to then sustain a household on their own. And whatever one thinks of the male breadwinner model, pro or con, I think at the time for a lot of working class women this was a huge break and a sign of social progress. More broadly, the dualization of labor markets benefited native labor in a variety of ways, with immigrants doing the worst work for the lowest pay. Native labor was able to move up into better positions, higher wages, managerial positions, and so on. Similarly, this baby boom generation that we also heard about this morning that was able to go to university was in part enabled by this workforce that was there to do this other kind of blue-collar labor. And finally, that immigrant labor paid taxes that helped fund the huge expansion of the social welfare state post-1945. And in some cases, immigrant labor was even part of that expanding welfare state. Thus, the British NHS and parts of the Dutch healthcare system turned to the Caribbean, for instance, to find nurses and other types of female healthcare workers who could come and staff the rapidly expanding healthcare system in those places. So there's the more direct linkage with the welfare state. So the general point being that the welfare state and prosperity and the gender order post-1945 was built on the backs of immigrant labor. and that recognizing this dependence of rich democracies on this exploited labor force is important in part because it reiterates the moral obligations of these societies that they accumulated towards these workers, and should also lead us to think that if this was true in the past, that this kind of gender order was built upon the backs of immigrant labor, well, we would expect it to continue into the present, a time also of a highly interdependent and globalized world. We wouldn't think that this has changed very much, but I'll come back to that in a minute. I think a third interesting lesson about the past is a political one, is to ask what politics enabled these rich democracies to draw in large numbers of migrant workers. And I think the answer is actually that the politics were relatively muted, in that there was relatively little democratic debate about the decision to turn to guest workers and bring them in large numbers to Western countries. The decisions were made largely behind closed doors, not in parliamentary politics, at least from what I've been able to tell so far. That it was largely technocratic elites making these kinds of cost-benefit decisions about migrant labor, about guest workers, about post-colonial labor in general, and that the political actors, including organized labor, seemed to largely go along. Exceptions being Britain, where there was a lot of contentious politics earlier than other places around immigration in the 1960s, but that in other places, European societies became transformed in a quite significant way without a lot of extensive discussion about it. That they became culturally and religiously much more plural, that they introduced large numbers of often ill-educated, poor people from rural parts of their societies into what were becoming advanced industrialized states, and they did this without a lot of democratic debate. And I think one result of this was to avoid what was, in fact, a quite cynical kind of policymaking on the part of elites, who wanted to try to avoid reckoning with the consequences of migration, to grab the gains without having to pay the costs. Thus, they often did very little to invest in this temporary labor force, relegating them to very poor living conditions. Think of the bidonvilles in France, for instance, the shanty towns. Made few provisions for education or training that would invest in these people who came, and were highly unwelcoming towards them once family reunification started to really take off in the 70s, and families would come and really require a lot of adjustment and assistance to integrate into these societies. Thus, we get to the contemporary conflicts, the second part of my presentation, which will be a lot quicker than the first part, because I know I only have so much time. But also because I think these are very familiar, but I would just point out that I think the conflicts around immigration today are very much a consequence of the way in which labor migration policy was done in this previous period. That the conflicts fueled by the social and economic exclusion of this migrant origin population and their offspring, we can blame to some extent on the way this whole policy was managed or not managed in the first place. That populations who came, as I indicated, were often very low skill and of a low education level, and they were the first ones to suffer from deindustrialization since the 1970s, being stuck in bad jobs, if they have them at all. That this is exacerbated by the lack of state investments in settling these populations, and that the intergenerational transmission of this disadvantage to at least a certain proportion of their children has produced considerable despair and disaffection in a number of immigrant origin communities. But then it's precisely the nexus of ethnic difference and economic disadvantage that has made immigration such a potent political issue in Europe. Perfect for right-wing politics, which is both xenophobic and can also use this as an issue to attack the technocratic elite who they blame for all of the problems that are being brought down upon them, and can blame the EU while they're at it, who can also be seen as part of the problem. So all of this is a good cauldron for any right-winger. You just have to listen to Geert Wilders in the Netherlands a bit, and you hear exactly all of these themes coming together in this right-wing discourse. But I think there are wider discontents, too, that have resulted, that as European societies have become diverse, they've been trying to figure out how to deal with this diversity, with this pluralism, with a host of questions they're not used to thinking about. That in essence, societies woke up at some point and realized that they had become culturally and ethnically and socially diverse in a way that they had not envisioned, and certainly there had not been a lot of political debate over. Similarly, immigrants and immigrant origin populations brought further challenges. They brought cultural challenges and social and political challenges. Think of the headscarf debates now in many European countries and the two varying sides of opinion on this. as a good example of this. More broadly, I would say the debates in recent years have been centrally about questions of gender and sexuality in the family, that it's precisely those kinds of questions that have become the kind of dividing line, or put forward as a dividing line in a sort of gendered clash of civilizations, as some people like to portray it, that's going on these days in Europe. All of this would seem to reinforce the view that immigration is not a solution to the demographic challenges in Europe, that it's politically unacceptable, but that even if it were acceptable, the moral issues, that it's morally problematic, given the way in which Western governments previously had incurred debts to these populations that they did not keep. And politically, there seems to be very little will to actually return on those debts. So future possibilities, are there any in light of this rather grim discussion? Well, I think as in the past, the social and economic order still continues to depend on immigrants and their labor, and will likely continue to do so in the future. That these OECD analyses that I've been reading recently and I referred to earlier show the significant contribution that migrant labor made to the big expansion of economy since the 1990s. And they look in particular at Southern Europe, and they look at the UK, and they say it was immigrant labor that had a lot to do with growth during this period. Low-wage labor, construction workers, but also higher-skilled labor. And they forecast significant reliance on immigrants in the future, both low and high skill, as I was indicating. Then, of course, there's the growing importance of migrant care work and all the feminist work that has been on this, showing in the long-term care sector in particular, but also in child care, home help, in a variety of areas. We can see how, once again, labor migration is underpinning the contemporary gender order, that the two-earner or single-parent family is very much sustained in many countries by this source of labor, be it through the outsourcing of care tasks to these workers, the creation of care marketplaces with cheap and flexible services, again subsidized by the low wages paid to the workforce. But then think more broadly about takeout food and dry cleaning and house cleaning and care services, and you see all the ways in which in so many countries immigrants and low-wage immigrant work has enabled these kinds of things to develop and to exist. I myself am reminded of this every time I go to my own daycare center here in the US and see that 75% of the people who work there speak Spanish and don't speak English very well, as do all the nannies who work in my neighborhood. So yes, as a member of the bourgeoisie, at some point when I became a homeowner, I realized that I have virtually an army of people who work for me who are all Spanish speaking. The people who mow my lawn, the people who trim my trees, the people who take care of my child, the people who clean my house. And I could not be a professor if I did not have this workforce to rely upon. But this is a story very much true in Southern Europe, where there has been an enormous influx of people providing this kind of labor. Also in France, even in Sweden, people talk about this now as a trend, and many other parts of Europe, that cheap migrant care has been essential for the two-earner household, for women to be in the labor market, but also has held down expenses for the state when it comes to developing child care and other types of supportive services for women's employment. So I don't really see us moving away from this anytime soon. If anything, one would expect this trend to intensify in the years ahead. So what to do? Well, rather than ignore the reality of this immigration, which I think has been the sort of dominant tendency, we need to basically face up to it and try to craft a humane immigration policy. What would that involve? I think it would involve a return to the idea of guest worker migration and temporary labor, but done in a different way. I think we need to think about things like circular migration programs for care, systems of permits and regulations that enable the oversight of this type of labor migration. The way it happens in the US right now, we do not have oversight, so it means it just opens up opportunities for abuse, either on the part of the caregivers themselves, but I think in particular the attention has been on how these care workers are often very vulnerable and dependent on the people they work for. And thus we need to really have a much more structured system to regulate and authorize and oversee what's going on. But I think we need to do this with full awareness of the idea that at least a good portion of, or a percentage of the people who come might want to stay. And so having avenues for people to not only come and work in various sectors, but to stay and bring their families is a reality we have to face, rather than do it in the 1945 to 1975 way of pretending that they're all going to go home and then being surprised when they do not. I think we also need to think about permanent labor migration programs, recognizing areas of need and ways to help people come with skills that would be helpful for the advanced industrialized countries, but then keep in mind the importance of investing in them and helping them stay and settle and adjust rather than the way we did this in the past. Most fundamentally, I think we need to try to bring this shadow care workforce out into the bright spotlight and not let the continued development of a black market of care work and home help work and so on, as we have in the United States. It's extremely well developed in the United States. It seems to be emerging in a lot of European countries, and it's something that has to be truncated. That through public subsidies and supports, but also regulation, these jobs could be turned into something that is not necessarily reinforcing the vulnerability of these workers who come. But I think, and here's where I get really utopian, I think this needs to be accompanied by a broad democratic debate in European countries. That we can't just let this happen, as in the past, just let migration sort of flow in and then deal with it later, or make decisions behind closed doors, but that instead political actors need to make an affirmative case for migration, for why it's valuable, for what it brings, both economically, but also socially and culturally, and why Western countries will continue to depend upon it, and thus the debts that we owe to the people who come and do this work. And I actually think current generations of immigrants and immigrant origin people can help make that case, that they should be a voting constituency for political actors who make these kinds of claims, and they could help make the case for why immigration is a good thing. Now, is this crazy? Am I crazy? Well, probably, because it does seem like in Europe these days, multiculturalism is about the dirtiest word you can say, and the anti-immigrant backlash seems quite severe. But again, I think coming from the US perspective, I often look at these European debates and I think, wow, this reminds me of the 1980s and part of the 1990s in the US, when we also grappled with multiculturalism, and it was the dirtiest word you could say, and everybody was running from it as fast as you could. And these days, however, I think the politics have shifted, and in part that's because there are so many immigrant origin voters in the United States, but also because this Generation Y that we were hearing about at lunch is a very different generation with regard to cultural diversity and pluralism, and I think just assumes diversity is sort of the normal way of of how society should be. And thus, for me, looking at the U.S. standpoint, I think an anti-immigrant, nasty stance that a lot of the Republicans are trying to still take is a losing one in the United States. It is a losing proposition. They will continue to lose in national politics as long as they make it. And my hope is that this will be the shift that will happen in Europe, but that what needs to happen is on the left, voices need to come forward that really make the affirmative case for immigration and for multiculturalism and for diversity, but also for thinking about the ways societies need to make it work and invest in the people who come. So that would be my message of hope.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. Our final presentation of the panel.
Oh, there is one.
Two more.
Skipped one.
Yeah, you did skip. I went ahead. That's okay.
I already skipped Gerda? No, I didn't skip Gerda. Yeah, I was about to skip Gerda. Our second to the last presentation. We only had two so far? I've already lost my other sheet. Our third presentation of the session will be by Gerda Neyer. Gerda Neyer is Associate Professor of Demography, Senior Research Associate at SUDA. She studies the intersection of demography and political science. She focuses on the role of institutional and political factors in family formation in contemporary Europe. She holds an MA in math and a PhD in political science. She's done numerous research projects and published in the field of social labor market migration, gender policies, as well as immigration from Austria. And then this switches into Swedish. Okay. I will attempt to find her presentation here.
Thanks very much indeed for the invitation to that conference, and not only a very nice group of researchers, but also very many feminists. And so I think it's very important to bring the feminist perspective into this gender and generation discussion, in particular with all the changes that are going on right now. Now, I'm working in demography now, and I've been working at the Demographic Institute for many, many years, but before, always my topic was how do different kind of policies affect certain kind of gender, other questions. So as I was also teaching feminist theory, whenever I was asked, why do you work in a demographic institute? That's impossible because that has the least to do with demography, or with feminism. However, I think demography has become more important over the last couple of years in the public debate. And there are two things that has already been around here. Population aging on the one hand, so life expectancy is above 80 in all of the Nordic, Western and Southern European countries, but it's still in the 70s or even close to the lower part of the 70s. In most of Eastern Europe, there are still big gender differences and differences by class as far as longevity is concerned. So that's the one reason. The second one is the low fertility in Europe. So Europe has one of the lowest fertilities together with some East Asian countries. The fertility is below what demographers call a replacement level. That's 2.1 children per woman. That would be a stable population that you can reproduce. It's below 1.5 in almost all European countries except the Western and the Northern European countries. And even though there has been a little increase lately, this has dropped with the economic crisis. I can show you some graphs if you want to, but I didn't do because most people know that. That has led to a new debate over the last 15 years, I would say. So low fertility has become an increasing political concern. In the 70s, according to UN data, practically no European country was concerned about the fertility level. Now, 2/3 of the European countries say that they are concerned about their low fertilities and that they have policies in place or consider policies to increase fertility. Also, the European Union, at least since 2000, has an increasing discourse on the low fertility, on measures to increase fertility. Now, as demographers, whenever there is a discussion on we should increase fertility, we should be careful. Because we know that reproduction has always been something that has been politically used. But now there is a shift in discourse. Namely, the low fertility discourse, as it is now, it's mostly an economic discourse and a population policy discourse. I didn't put the population policy in here because I will focus on the economic issues. It's the shrinking labor force, the economic decline that will come from that, the loss in productivity and technological advancement because young people in developing countries are considered as good for productivity and technology. In developing countries, they are more prone to revolution. So I'll just say that because these are the two things how youth are seen. There is a loss in economic competitivity because of the shrinking population, and there is a fear in labor in the welfare state decline, mostly in the sustainability of pension, healthcare, and care. There is also, as I said, the population policy discourse, namely that immigration will be the only thing to sustain low fertility, but that will cause social and other problems. So even though we know that fertility will not solve the economic concerns, nevertheless, there is a focus on we should increase fertility in order to solve those social problems, similar to what we heard this morning about the French. That's now on the European level. This is a significant shift, I think, from seeing fertility as a women's and a gender issue or a feminist issue and carried by a feminist movement. I know the feminist movement is very, very split on that issue, but over the since the 1990s, I would say, care and fertility issues have always been there, but care has been an issue that came more into the feminist movement. So from a women's and gender issue to an economic issue. So that has moved actually also from the feminist movement to the mainstream political institutions. Now, what does that mean, and what was the answer to that? On the one hand, and we have heard that already, in contrast to the cuts and the restrictions in the classical welfare state areas like unemployment and pension insurance, we have had an expansion in the family policies in Europe. And here are all the family and welfare state researchers that have worked on that, so I don't really go into that in detail. But just very quickly, there has been an expansion or even an introduction of parental leave over the last 15 years in almost all European countries, and the EU has at least set a minimum of such leaves. There has been an introduction of care leave. That means an extended parental leave so that people can take care of their children, usually until they are 3 years old. There has been an expansion in the childcare provisions, even though that has been much slower than all the other ones. And there is more and more a promotion of part-time work. This is the discourses, and those are also the policies that are usually brought forward as being policies that could actually help to increase fertility. Now, on the one hand, we could say that is a very good development, because it's a recognition of care in the welfare state discourse. And this was something that feminists have long claimed, that we want care as a substantial part of welfare state discussions. Now it's there. On the other hand, the way that the expansion of the parental leave and the care leave and those things have happened also shows that this was not the same in all the countries. There was still a prevalence of the ideological path that the different countries have taken before. So the more conservative countries have expanded their parental leave. There were very few really paradigmatic changes, like Germany in 2007 really changed to a more gender equal, and the less conservative, where mothers should stay at home and take care of the children. But in general, even in the more gender equal countries like the Nordic countries, there has been a shift towards what I would call a conservative and family care option. Finland, Sweden, and Norway have extended the possibility to stay home until the child is 3 years old if the parents don't take up child care leave, which is a conservative development in the policies. There has also been a shift towards what I call a neoliberal option. That means in some countries, they have put on existing policies, other policies that would cater to specific groups. Like Austria, which was always a conservative country, had a long parental leave, but now they have 5 different kinds of parental leaves where you can choose between 1 year and 3 years to stay home and get money on that. So this was layered on it to have different kind of groups cater to the very specific policies. And I think all the policies still focus on mother's reconciliation of work and care. The father's care is less rigorously debated, and it's also not as rigorously implemented within the policies as the focus mothers and reconciliation of work and care. Having said that, all the demographers and all the feminists have always pointed out family policies are not something that are directed towards fertility. They are at the intersection of employment, care, and gender policies. So the shift that we have had now towards fertility issues as a gender and women's issue on the one hand, to economic issue and reconciliation of work and care, something went wrong. So we have to ask, what does that actually mean? Is it an opportunity to get greater and achieve greater gender equality because the discussion is now more within the gender in the mainstream of issues that are there? Or will that create new inequalities through these types of family policies that we have? And are those family policies really sufficient for fertility on the one hand and for the gender and the equality discussion on the other hand? So I leave this out. I'm a demographer, so what you will get to see are now mostly examples on how different kind of policies affect childbearing. I don't use that to show which policies help to increase fertility. I use those examples to show what kind of cleavages are there that we see via the fertility. Okay? And I will show you several examples. The first one is parental leave and income support, the family policies and how they work in different kind of economic developments, part-time work and equality, how that works, and men and fathers and family policies. You will ask, why don't you have childcare? I left this out there. I took it out in the last minute. The one hand is that there is no doubt that childcare is an essential element and it is absolutely necessary. There are very few studies because it's very difficult to actually study whether childcare has an influence or not because it's methodologically very, very difficult. But we have already heard from Pearl some examples, so I'm not going to bring some examples. If you want to hear it later, I can show you some examples that are there. But I leave those out. I take more the family-oriented ones that actually go also within the family because childcare is more an institutional aspect. The first one, parental leave and income support. It is very difficult in general to study how do policies affect certain kind of aspects because you have to look not on a general thing. We usually say, okay, there is high fertility in countries that have this kind of policy and low fertility in countries that have this kind of policy. And then we look at fertility only at the total fertility rate. The demographers would say the total fertility rate that is always used in political discourses is not a very good measurement because it is influenced by the timing of the birth. That means if in this year all the women would decide, no, we are not going to have a child, the total fertility rate would be 0. So as women stay longer in education, they postpone childbirth. And fertility is low because they're not having it during that time. Yeah? So what we have to look really is if and when we implement a policy, how was the behavior of the same group of women before the policy and after the policy? And it's very difficult to get such data. You often cannot do that with surveys because you do not have enough cases. Yeah? So, and you have to do it in a comparative perspective because there are many, many factors that influence childbearing in one specific year that you decide for. So you need to have a comparative perspective in order to see whether if you have the same policy in another countries at another time, do you get the same effect or not? So what we did here with colleagues was to study all the Nordic countries and use registered data. The Nordic countries have data where you can use the entire population to study the behavior. So all this is not based on surveys of a couple thousand. It is always based on all women in a specific age group. You see little arrows. Those are the 4 Nordic countries. And I show you here the second birth intensities. I'm not going into that. I'm using here the second birth because it shows it most clearly. We always know in demography you have to study the first, the second, and the third birth separately because the behavior is always different and the policies also work differently. But I use here the second one because it's the most clear one, but also if we look at the first one, we would have a very similar pattern, in particular for women who are a little bit older because in general, over the time that we are looking at, women usually have their children at a higher age. Where you see the arrow is the time when the Nordic countries introduced an income-related parental leave benefit or switched to an income-related benefit where they pay the mother between 80 and 100% of their previous income. In all countries, we see that this led to a change in the behavior. It stopped the decrease in the second birth rate or the general decrease in fertility, except in Sweden. Sweden is the green one. Why did it not work in Sweden immediately? It comes a little bit later. Because it was introduced in 1974 when female labor force participation was still not so high. That was number one. And number two, it was exactly introduced when the economic crisis hit, the oil crisis of 1974. Okay? That already gives us a hint on the workings of policy in a crisis. Oops. What I want to say here is, I go back. How do I go back? Just a moment. Go back to this one. What this shows is that income replacement has become an essential element within those family policies. Children are, or the decision for children depends on that during the time when I'm on parental leave, my income and the income of the family is maintained. We see that even more, and it has become more pronounced in all the Nordic countries, that income is an essential element for having children at all. The higher the income, the more likely it is that women have a first and also a second child. This is the 4 Nordic countries. From 0 to 10, you see the income decimals, and you clearly see that for women aged 30 to 45, this is the group when most women have their first child, you see very clearly that the higher the income, the more likely they are to become a mother. For the Nordic countries, in particular Finland, but also Denmark and Sweden, and to a lower extent Norway, the women who have the lowest income and the lowest education, the same applies to men, are now the ones who have the highest childlessness. It's completely different from 40 years ago when it was the highly educated who didn't have children. Now it is the low educated and the ones with low income. So income has become an essential element as far as birth are concerned. I come to the economic crisis. I take the same picture as I had before, and the circles, I only show Sweden, the green one, and the yellow line is a little bit bad to see. That is Finland. Both countries in 1990 were hit by an economic crisis. In Sweden, as you can see, in 1990, the increase that was in fertility turned in a decrease, and actually the overall fertility in Sweden fell, so that Sweden was in 1995 the country with the lowest total fertility rate all over Europe, despite the fact that Sweden had very high childcare, very generous gender equality policies, and very gender parental leave policies. So nevertheless, it had the lowest fertility. In Finland, we had exactly the opposite. Finland was hit by an even worse crisis. But Finland had introduced a parental leave or a care leave that came into full bloom in 1990. That meant if you had a child and you didn't put your child in childcare, you could get a childcare benefit that was almost as much as a child would cost to be in public care. And it was paid on top of unemployment benefit. Because of that, the care leave plus the employment helped you to maintain your income. And that actually led that many more women had a second child, in particular those who were unemployed. That was exactly the opposite in the Swedish case. The drop in fertility in the Swedish case was caused by more women being unemployed or staying in education because of the economic crisis, since the parental leave in Sweden was dependent on your former income. Women abstained from having a child in that time. But what happened after the economic crisis? In Sweden, the fertility picked up again, while in Finland, after the economic crisis, the fertility fell. Why? Because those women who had stayed out of the labor market for 3 years could not get into the labor market after that. And it led to an additional cleavages between women, because it was the lower educated women and the women who had greater difficulties in the labor market, as I said, those were already unemployed, who couldn't get back into the labor market. And because of that, the fertility fell. So a conservative policy helped to get through the crisis, but it had a long-term negative effect on the fertility rate. So we cannot say that the family policy has a universal effect. It interacts very clearly with the economic situation that is there. Income maintenance is the more important one than whether you are in employment or not. I come to part-time work and equality. And here I will show you, oops, I have to go back again. Part-time work has always been seen as something that will help women to combine work and care. Okay? There are some surveys who say, okay, women who work part-time are more likely to have a second child. But that only works in the conservative welfare states. How does it work in other welfare states? In the conservative welfare states, it has worked so far because women were dropping out of the labor force when they had their first child. But now that there is an economic crisis, women go more into the labor market, and also the EU pushes to be more in the labor market. Would part-time work actually help? For that study, we used Danish data. And in general, what we did here was we were asking the question, we know that women in specific occupations have higher fertility than women in other occupations. For example, in general, we know that women who have a degree in teaching and health have higher fertility than women who have something else. This is often said, okay, because those women who choose that want to have children. They are more child prone, they want to work with children and things like that. Occupation, to study occupation has a little problem because you have the hierarchy and you have the preferences in it and you have the branch, the structural element. So we decided we want to see whether there is an occupational or a branch aspect. The branch aspect, if women in a branch have a specific behavior, it means that the structural elements are the more important one than what is my personal preference. There are hardly any branch data around. Again, you cannot use surveys, but Denmark had data. And so we took Danish data and looked at all women between 1981 and 2001, and we looked at different kind of things. Among them, how many women were working in that branch, how many part-time was in that branch, and whether the branch expanded or whether it contracted, because there is an expanding ones, they pay higher wages because they need to attract and things like that. Contracting means higher unemployment, higher risks, you would have lower fertility. I show you first the part-time. What you see here is that it's not correct that if there is a higher share of part-time in a branch, that you have a higher fertility. This is first birth rates. You see that in the ones that have low, only up to 10%, they have at least 20% higher childbearing risks than our comparing group, and the comparing group are women working in the public sector, the public administration. I have to say this is controlled by age and education. It is not caused by education or something like that, because we considered that in our analysis. And you see that where we have very high part-time work, like in the hotel and restaurant business, for example, or some other ones over there are manpower, so where you things, or leisure, or things like that. I didn't put in all the names, it would be too much. We have actually very low fertility. We see exactly the same when we look at other aspects. And again, if we compare that, we see that the element and what is behind it is that the branches that have high part-time work are the branches that have low income and bad working conditions. The same that we show here applies to expanding branches. All the expanding branches have low fertility because these are not branches with very good income. Quite on the contrary, they're in the low-paying service sector. This would be, okay, no, I leave this out. Men and fathers and family policies. We know from a lot of studies in the meantime that if men take some of the parental leave and if they share some of the household work, the family will have a second or a third child. That shows you exactly that. That means compared to those men who to those family where the father doesn't take any leave, that is none. The other ones are like up to 20% higher if the father takes between 10 and 25% of the parental leave. If the father takes more, the fertility is lower, or the risk that they have a second child is lower. So only if men take a very small part of the parental leave can we have a positive effect. from qualitative research that we did in Austria, and I know now also from qualitative research in Switzerland. And I hope there will be soon qualitative research from Sweden and other countries that also do that. The reason why fathers go on parental leave is not necessarily because they want to take care of the child. The reason is that there is something in their economic and in their professional life. Either they want to change their profession and they want a timeout, or their company changes somehow, and if you go on parental leave, you are protected from being fired. Or they fear that they are getting unemployed, and so for professional reasons, they are taking the parental leave and not so much for the care leave. And they return to behave as they behaved before, namely not doing much more once they come back from the parental leave. I have to say one additional very important point is that women have to insist that men go on parental leave, and they have to get about the same income as men do, otherwise they don't go. But what about men and childbearing? In general, we think that if men who work in female-dominated jobs will have more children than men who work in male-dominated jobs. Again, we take the Danish data because they're really very nice. And we see that's exactly the opposite. Here I show you only part-time, but I can show you exactly the same graph for share of women in a specific branch. The more masculine the branch is, the fewer women there are in the branch, the more likely men are to become fathers and have a second child. It's the construction, the car things, and those things where men are having a second child. Why? Again, it is those branches where they have relatively good income and higher income than in the female-dominated branches, which have lower incomes also for men. So what we see here is it is not only the employment that is important, it is employment and income that has become more important. To say it with what Orlov has said, the maintenance of a household for women and for men has become an essential element in that aspect. So if we see that, we have to ask ourselves as feminists, we have put so much emphasis on care and the family. Should we start to reorient ourselves and look more on employment and on the internal structures? So going back to what Marxist feminists had in the 1970s, that we need to change the structure of the labor market. It apparently, as the branches show, it's not only sufficient to go by gender mainstreaming on that issue, because we will not change that structural aspects that are there. But at the same time, those structural aspects are very important, because what I showed you a little bit or tried to explain is the cleavages that have come out between highly educated and women with income and those who do not have income and are not highly educated. Now we can say it's not important to have children at all, but we should see it as an element of inequality if those who are low educated and have low income are not able to have children anymore, while those who are highly educated can fulfill their wishes for children. So the cleavages that are between women are just as important when we look from a gender perspective. So should we not start to look and drive for economic and labor market policies that take care into consideration in a completely new way? But I actually do not know what that new way would be, and I end by this.
Thank you very much. I was not playing with my phone there. I just forgot my pen up here at the beginning of that talk, so I was taking my notes on the phone. Our last talk is by Chiara Saraceno, which is up here somewhere.
Okay, very short.
And while I'm looking for that, I just will say I have a great time. Those of us who study the U.S. and these questions have a terrific time sport choosing between the European work-family policies we would like or not like when we have zero chance of having any work-family policy ever implemented. So it's a cost-free form of entertainment for us. So I enjoy that. Maybe this is per Miami. Okay, great. Okay, well, but I was going to do your introduction.
Oh, no.
All right. Well, you can. I'll be very brief. Chiara Saraceno was until 2008 a professor of sociology at the University of Turin. She had a chair in sociology of the family. She taught comparative social structure on gender and society. In 2006, she worked at a university in Berlin with a long German name. And she worked on developing research projects in the area of demographic development, social change, and social capital. She is now retired and lives in Turin, where she is an honorary fellow at the Collegio Carlo Alberto and teaches on social change with an international master in European social policies. She works on comparative family, gender, and intergenerational arrangements, comparative social policy, social inequality, and poverty. So we're delighted to have her, and that's
coming last is a bit complicated. I am afraid I will try not to overlap too much, both with Per and with Nerda, because we are a bit on the same line. So we are speaking of generations within the family and not of generation in society. So we moved the concept of generation. Maybe it's clearer when we speak of generations within the family. So it's clear. Children, parents, grandparents, while generation in societies are less clear. They are not always there, as Mannheim would say. And what I will say actually is partly based on research I did under peer coordination. It was a European multilinks. She already mentioned it. And what I will try to show is how social policies, particularly social policies, not only social policies, shape the context. So instead, I will not speak of linked lives, but of lives in context, and context which is shaped to a great deal of by social policies and by civil law regulations, which in some way take as granted, in some degree prescribe, in some degree support intergenerational obligations. What is interesting, I think, is that usually social policies, and I'm speaking not only of family policies, strictly sensu, whatever family policies are, which is a very ambiguous term, but social policy in general have been studied, particularly by feminists, as also gender policies, much less as intergenerational policies. What I'm trying to do here is to see how social policies, to a large degree, are gender policies, and we have known that for a long time, but are also intergenerational policies insofar they set the context, sometimes even normative, sometimes only a resource or constraint context, in which intergenerational obligations within the family are played out. And Pearl already showed some of these. I will not show the outcomes, but I will show mostly the context. Okay, but before I start, I want to start with this figure, which is taken by Poor and others. Poor is at the University of Tallinn. Within the Multilinks project, he did this projection showing how the demography of intergenerational relation has changed since the 1950s in Europe. And the upper line is the proportion of children 0 to 4 to adults between 25 and 29. And the lower line is the proportion of 75, 79-year-old to the 50, 54-year-old. And I find this figure, which I use quite often, very interesting because it showed not so much the increase of the older generation. It has increased, but not so incredibly. Also because we are all going to die, luckily. But I am, since I am moving very fast toward the 75, 79, I'm almost there, so I'm a little bit scared. I always say I'm still a resource, but I'm going to be a need shortly. In the way we talk about that, I'm a little bit involved in this. And so this has increased, but not so incredibly, while what has decreased incredibly is the number of children. And this supports what Per was already saying, that in speaking of intergenerational obligation, and even more reductively of care needs, we are in the policy and public discourse, we are focusing too much or too exclusively on childcare. And even that we do with a limitation, because we look at childcare until a child is 6. Then when the child enters elementary school, no need whatsoever. They are totally autonomous beings. They do not need one thing. But so we look only narrowly to childcare, to intensive childcare, and we do not see that what is growing is some kind of frail elderly care. I say it cautiously, but I know that it is likely that some degree of frailty will happen because we do not die from one day to the next, being very healthy and then die. It does not happen like that all the time. Okay, so that is, and when I saw this figure the first time, I thought of that book by, I don't remember her name. It was The Women's Estate. She was a British. Gerda, yeah, okay. She in the 70s argued that the fertility decline had reduced the time to giving birth, but this time had been substituted for by intensive, longer care. I don't think that we can argue that any longer, although our precious children are very precious and we care for them for a long time and we invest in them, they are still too few to fill the whole life course of, or adult life course of a woman. But this is being filled increasingly by elderly care. There has been a study by the European Foundation for Improving Living and Working Conditions. They do periodically studies on different issues, and it was on work. And they found, I don't remember exactly the percentage, but there is a substantial percentage of the working population who has some kind of responsibility to care for a frail elderly. Not full-time, maybe there are even men. So, although there are gender differences in terms of the intensity, but overall there is. So actually, conciliation problem, if we want to use this jargon, are problems which concern increasingly the second period of the working life in, and part of the pension of the retirement age as well. Upward caring responsibility. Then grandmothers have also downward, but that is an additional issue. And here I'm speaking only of the elderly, but we forget that non-child care needs can arise in any time during the life course due to accident or due to even because of the improvement of medicine. So people survive to accident or to serious impairment much more now than they did in the past. And this too should be taken account of. Okay. So in this context, in European families, all studies, all empirical studies show that women still bear the main responsibility for child and frail elderly care. So care continues to be a very gendered issue. And this has negative impact on their economic, financial capability. There is a modest penalty and a smaller daughter penalty meaning the upward. Although whether it is smaller, it is because there are fewer daughters in this cohort, in this generation, who are in the workforce, and therefore they don't have the penalty because they already had it in the past, exiting the labor force, but also I think because empirical research shows that while many mothers still reduce or their labor force participation or exit because of the presence of a child, very few daughter and daughter-in-law exit the labor force because they have caring responsibility. So they try to juggle more. Yeah. There are probably different moral motivations you feel, or maybe or not only moral, pleasure. You may have pleasure to care for your child full time. Rarely you have pleasure to care for a frail parent, even if you love him or her very much, because elderly, frail people are not pleasant. I mean, you can love, you can be, but we must say, they are not pleasant. They are not pleasant body to touch or to. Okay. But given this, I can say it because I'm getting old. I would have not said it when I was younger. Okay. It is a sensitive issue. There are cross-country differences, however, in these kind of penalties. And these differences are structured in the interplay between social policies, labor market conditions, and not generic, not only general labor market condition or the kind of labor market condition Nerda was speaking about, but also what is discussed in the variety of capitalism literature, that is, which kind of work is, labor demand is there. And also in interaction with cultural models of gender and intergenerational relations. And this interplay, and specifically the role played by social policies, impacts also on inequalities among women. Gerda is right. So we should increasingly address the issue of inequalities among women and not only of gender inequalities, in the possibility to conciliate family and paid work responsibilities. Very quickly, what is my theoretical framework? Thea knows it, so she will get bored, but I have to say it. So
Good work.
In looking at policies from a gender and intergenerational perspective, and based on work by other people, not only by myself, Orloff and other people, I think that we can find 3.5, let's say, policy approaches. And I must say immediately that these approaches are found in all countries. So it's not that one country has one approach and another country has a different approach. Actually, the differences between the countries are in the overall balance, but also across fields of intervention. So whether they concern children or whether they concern old people, but also whether we are looking at income support or whether we are looking at services. So it is a way of thinking at policies more than at constructing typologies of countries, okay? So what I call supported familialism, that is explicit support through money, usually, and time off, is given to families, to individuals, in order for them to have time to care or to devote to their family obligations. Then there is defamilization, which is the most well-known, defamilization through the provision, the taking out of some responsibility by through public responsibility. Then there is what I call, particularly looking at the US case, although I have not studied it directly, but looking at the literature on the US case, is defamilization through the market. I call it a half concept because in order to be defamilized to the market, actually it is you need some family income. So it is defamilization through the market through familization. Okay, so you are dependent on the family resources. So it's not totally defamilization. Okay, and then we come back to that. And then there is what I call familialism by default. That is, there is no support of any kind, but just the family is expected to provide, sometimes even prescribed. I don't know in the United States, but in many European countries, in civil law, there are what are called obliged kin. That is, not only parents have to support their children until they come of age, but they could be expected to support them until they are they are economically autonomous, or children are legally expected to, and so on and so forth. And that, so familialism by default may be just what is taken as given, so just not providing anything. Implicitly, we expect that the family provides, or it could be prescribed by law. As I said, these approaches are combined in the different countries. And what I do now, I show you some of these, how I organize this with regard to policies concerning children, the responsibilities, downward responsibilities toward children, and upward responsibilities towards one's own parents. Okay, it's something which has been already said, but this is the background, is the context. So an example of supported familialism, a typical example is parental leaves. It's time off with a maintenance of job guarantee and some degree of income support. Okay, so this is why I call it supported familiarism. You are supported to stay to do your work as parent. If somebody thinks that there is such a thing like a European social model, looking at these graphs, okay, yes, we have a EU directive saying that there should be a leave, maternity and parental leave. Must be a minimum, but within the minimum, the differences are quite great. Just to explain how the graph is made, the light gray part is the quota reserved to mothers. That is what we conventionally call the maternity leave, before and after pregnancy, birth. And you see that with few exceptions, there is not great differences across countries in the length. Okay, and also I would say there is not great difference in how they are paid, because with few exceptions, they are paid mostly as a percentage, which is between 80 and 100% of wages. So they are income related, mostly, not everywhere. But the dark green part is the parental leave, what comes after, which in Europe should be open also to fathers, according to the European directive. It's not, depending on the country, there is a reserve quota for fathers or not. It can be taken all by one parent, but it cannot. But if the father wants to take it, part of it, he is individually entitled to take it. Okay. And then the dot is the maximum length in which the leave is paid. It does not say how much is paid. In another study, we weighted it, and there are quite strong differences. But this is how much is paid. But what is interesting, in some countries, it's not at all paid. You know, on the left, on the right side for you, which are the Greece, Belgium. No, Belgium is paid. Cyprus, Malta, and so on. Okay. This is one example of supported familialism. Another supported familialism, which is usually not looked at very carefully, and also for its innovative impact. Actually, Corpi, for instance, argues that any kind of supported familialism is gender unequal. Here I give an example of a supported familialism which actually can act towards an equality, because it is whether fathers are incentivized to take a quota of the leave. You know that according to comparative studies, there are two conditions are needed for the fathers to take it. It's an empirical fact, not a theoretical fact. And the two conditions, and they have to be together, is that the leave must be well paid, and that there must be a reserve quota. If there is not one of these two conditions, fathers are not going to take even a small part of the leave. And my two favorite examples opposite are Denmark and Italy. In Denmark is well paid, but there is no reserve quota. In Italy is little paid or no paid, but there is a reserve quota. The percentage of fathers in Denmark and Italy who take the leave is exactly the same, low. Differently from Sweden or Norway, where both conditions are present. So in any case, here I see what is the total the total time that theoretically fathers could take if they wanted, and what is the reserve quota. I just want to point out that in none of the Eastern European countries there is an incentive for fathers The Eastern European countries are those where there is the longest leave, up to 3 years, but in none of these countries there is an incentive for fathers to take the leave. And then an example of defamilization, the usual example in childcare, which is child care services for children, for preschool children, divided for children under 3 and 3 to school age. And again, you see that the European social model is not so clear, particularly for children under 3. So there is a model penalty, but there is also inequality among women, because not all women, particularly in the countries where there is a larger degree of familialism by default, have less resources to stay in the labor forces. We did, but I don't have time to study to see the impact of parental leaves and of childcare on the labor market participation of women, and I will just tell you the results. And as Gerda already said, childcare is the most important. Childcare for children under 3 is the most important item for women to stay in the labor force later on. And surprisingly, given the debate in even in the feminist literature, long leaves apparently do not have a negative impact. Of course, it depends on where you put the threshold. We put the threshold below and above 9 months, and actually we found that the negative impact was there when the leave was too short, that is, was below 9 months. Okay, but I don't have time. Quickly going to the defamilization in policies in upward obligations. Again, this gives you the figures on services for the elderly, home care and institutionalization. No European social model. There is a percentage of services on the population above 65. I know that is silly, 65 is too young, but that is what the data are. I don't have the time to go in this, but I wanted to look at supported familization in elderly care. You know that there are not care leaves. There is not a European directive, even not a European recommendation regarding, but in some countries there are care leaves which concern not children but dependent adults, including the frail elderly. And also in some countries, time devoted both to having children and to have being the main caregiver for a frail or for a dependent adult are acknowledged in what we call fictitious contribution towards the pension right. So you get the state pays contribution into your records so that you get a higher pension or whatever. So, and here there are countries which have both, countries which have it only for children, and countries which have nothing. Okay. Just to conclude, although I had less time, it is given this complexity of the different fields, and not only different fields but also different means to intervene into intergenerational obligation, it is very difficult to identify specific regimes. We tried any kind of clustering, and only the Scandinavian countries came out only with some coherence. With some coherence, the others were all scattered all around. But what we can see is that with regard to children, there is a large degree of variation in the combination of the three approaches. With regard to the old, of course, there is defamilization in terms of income support, because the old are those, even in the countries where there is no provision for the poor, they have a minimum pension almost everywhere. There is a guaranteed pension in any case, although with varying levels of generosity. But the defamilization of care is much less established, as we saw in the figure before. And actually, Arlau Leira, my Norwegian colleague, has written of care as an incomplete social right in the case, non-health care I'm speaking of, in the case of the elderly. And to finish and link into what Kimberly said, in this framework, we should not forget immigration. She's right. And immigration is important, particularly in what I call defamilization through the market. Although in some countries it has also been part of the defamilization through public services. And the Italian and Williams and Gavanas have rightly written that there is a link, a clear link between policy regimes or care regimes and migration regimes. That is, in many countries, actually, the way migration is regulated has a strong impact on the way care is provided, and even whether the state or the public, there is a public responsibility of care or not. The Italian case from this point of view is exemplary, because it is a country where the lack of care services, particularly for the frail old, has been addressed through what I would call a bottom-up welfare reform, that is using migration as a resource. Families started to hire regular or irregular migrant care workers. So they went to the market, so it's a way of familization, but also market, through the market, defamilization, and then they regularize their care workers through the periodical regularization of migrants in my country. But that is too long to explain. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of the panelists, and to you for staying through a lengthy panel of a lot of information and different perspectives. I'm not going to say hardly anything to get to the discussion. Allow the panelists to respond to each other, and those of you, everybody else, to offer their comments. I'll make one quick observation and one thought. One observation is the issue of the handoff that is supposed to occur when children reach age 6 is very interesting. It's not just a blind spot that researchers have. I survey the students in my sociology of family course, and they're mostly women, and I ask them what their plans are for work and family life. And they usually say they're very intent on completing their education before they get married, and have children, so they're going to complete their education, maybe get a master's degree, and start a successful professional career so they can get married when they're 26 to 28, have 2 or 3 or 4 children. The expected TFR in my class is like 3.3. And then they're going to get right back to their professional career as soon as their youngest child turns 6, and be something like a dean. So, as one woman said in my class, and I have no doubt she can, but they can't all. So, but that goes. One of the things that highlights is the way when I'm trying to frame these issues. I'm thinking of the old state family market arena overlap of these three institutional arenas. Each one has its own politics and its own sources of inequality. And the interesting thing for me, listening to the conversation about Europe and the European Union, is I usually think of this state-family market triumvirate of institutional arenas as occurring within national contexts. Of course, then the question becomes, you have a supranational governance and markets, and to some degree family regimes, and so the question is, the system becomes extremely complicated when you try to map out the dynamics of how these things are nested within and between national context. So I have no explanation for this, and I think Chiara's discussion of the lack of clusters is very important for this, because the diversity in these on each of these dimensions is super challenging and raises lots of possibilities. So with that, I'm going to stop there, and I'd like to get as many comments as we can from you in the audience, and we'll have the panelists have a chance to respond, including to each other. So we have a microphone. Anything at all? Just got one back there.
This question is directed to the panel. You guys can discuss it however you would like, but particularly to Chiara. Well, thank you all, actually, firstly. And I'm a senior undergraduate in international relations and political science. And I'm curious as to how you think the intimacy of the relationship between caregivers coming from outside of Italy and other European countries, how that relationship will change social fabric and change ideas about what it means to be part of those particular countries and social groups.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. I have mainly some observations, but maybe not to you, Pearl. Sorry. So, if I could ask Kimberly about her solutions in a way. And I was struck, I suppose, by their particularity, if I could say that. So I thought they were very national level responses to what to me is a transnational issue, and indeed a problem caused many ways by the developed countries of the North and the West. And so I thought your solution on the one hand was too national. I thought also your second solution, which was how we treat our migrants, should really be about how we treat our people, and particularly those who work in low-waged employment, because there is, I think, an issue there that everybody who works in low-wage employment, many of whom are of course migrants, but some who are not migrants, are poorly treated. So I think there's a broader set of issues there. And also I thought your third one, or the third one that I picked up, was that everybody should be, or we should make plans that some of our migrants want to stay. And again, that seems to me really to put a plaster on a system which is a very exclusive sense of citizenship, and that what we should be really revisiting is how we understand inclusion and exclusion, and not being prepared to allow a few people to be included but the majority excluded. So that was my question to you. And to Gerda, I wondered about the Scandinavian countries and what they have to say really about the relationship between a system constructed, a social economic policy system constructed primarily, or where gender equality is a really big principle. I know it varies across countries. What does the Scandinavian experience say about the relationship between gender equality and fertility success in fertility? If low-income people can't have children or are having fewer children in Scandinavia, I find that really quite extraordinary with the kind of system that they have. So that was my question to you. And to Chiara, do you think the fact that you couldn't find intergenerational care regimes or is that something, could it be that concept is wrong? That in fact we shouldn't look for them because care for children and care for older people or adults is kind of conceived by policymakers and indeed made by policymakers, with very different orientations and in very different departments, etc. And so I wondered a little bit whether the concept was wrong. Sorry, I took too long.
But all right.
I'll volunteer. I wanted to put together two of the things that you've been talking about. One is this question of generations across families, and the other question is this question of migration. So if you're going to have your grandparents take care of the kids, or if you're going to take care of your grandparents and help bathe them or mow their lawn, that means you have to be in the same place that they are. And one thing I think the American experience, I think, might be a little bit different in this than the European experience, but I think there's a lot of people in this country who don't live in the same place as their parents, not even the same time zone as their parents, right, or their children. And I think one of the things that I've been noticing in Europe since this most recent crisis hit is it seems like Europeans, especially this Generation Y, are starting to look a lot more like Americans in that they're moving from Spain to Germany to get a job, or they're going from Portugal to Holland. And so I wonder if Pearl, in any of your research, if you've looked at this question of what happens when generations are geographically separated, and how does that affect these types of regimes of care?
Should I continue or yeah? Okay. Okay. Thank you. It's okay. I have a brief comment because unfortunately I wasn't here for most of the panel, but I do have your passports back, so that's good news.
We can migrate.
Huh?
We can now migrate.
Okay. So I did something done. Get something done. So I just had a brief comment for some of the points that Chiara raised about defamiliarization. So one is related to, so I think, so particularly related to the defamiliarization through the market. And I think you raised an important point in that it's not completely defamiliarization because it still relies on resources from the family. At the same time, I was thinking about defamiliarization of reinforcing family relations or not. So in that sense, do we consider hiring domestic workers to take care of elderly in their own private homes, reinforcing family values or not? And the same can be true about these policies that some European countries have to actually give money to families so that one member of the family is staying at home and taking care for the elderly or for children. So do we call that, like, how do we really call that in terms of like thinking about family values, family relations, and things like that? And the other kind of like more broader question, when you mentioned the defamiliarization through the market, you particularly associated with the US model, and I just wonder whether we are undermining the relevance of market for providing care in European countries. My feeling is that it has been growing substantially, the role of the markets in many places. So I just wonder, like, how do we start to incorporate that in how changes of the welfare state in Europe are taking shape? Thanks.
Okay, I just wanted to make one relatively small comment, and then we can pass it back for a bit. And that is relative to this question of migration that Kimberly raised and the providing care. One of the elements that's missing from that is the migrant workers who are providing care themselves have families or don't have families. And the regulation of the families in that sort of transnational care chain and how that is being understood, especially when some of the migration and low wage work is potentially, at least, not just from outside the EU to inside the EU, but among EU countries. So, to what extent uh, the care chain drain of care is within the EU a source of inequalities among countries, as well as a gender inequality, and that reinscription that Kim was also talking about, that's kind of new to Europe, of low income and ethnic difference, if that is also overlaid with a reinscription, if you will, of non-investment in the children of ethnicized workers, then you're building a structure of inequality that is racialized even within the EU. And I think the US has lots of, I don't know whether to call them great or horrible, greatly horrible examples of how racialized inequalities become very hard to eradicate, or very hard to address. And if the EU is moving in that direction among member states, that could be a very long-term danger, that I don't know how EU policymakers could respond.
Maybe we should come back to the panel. We can go in order of those who have waited the longest since speaking. So that would be Pearl first, if you'd like to.
Well, thanks for the comments. I'm going to pick out a couple. I'm going to start with combining the question back there, which I think was the intimacy of the migrant caring and the consequences of that for the migrants' assimilation. No? Yeah, okay. And then questions here on transnational families. That's Myra's comment and your comment on the geographic distances. If you look at the literature on the transnational families, and that's not the same as the large distances in the United States. There's this aura of concern. You've got the abandoned children and the abandoned elderly, Eastern Europe and Asia. And this is a new research topic. The way it's developed, it's first is that people have started to look at new technologies and the way the new technologies enable the maintenance of family bonds across great distances. Think of Skyping, think of Facebooking, think of WhatsApping. So that has enabled people to stay in contact very, very carefully. But another is that the migration, the fact that the migrants are getting money that they can send back home, actually improves the circumstances of those who have been abandoned. Studies of China, for example, but also studies of Romania, of Ukraine, because so far they're just isolated studies because it's a very new topic, but they time and time show that the position of the children who are being abandoned is actually being improved because money is coming in to send them to better schools. And the position of these poor abandoned elderly is also improving because they're getting money to purchase medication, not to purchase care because that's just not possible yet in these countries. So that's a new twist on migration, which fits a little bit with what Kimberly has been saying, that the migration improves the circumstances of the migrants, but also of their families. And yes, the care that we've been talking about, the care for parents, the care for children, it does require geographic proximity, that's true. But what's typical for the United States, and what we're also seeing in Europe, is that parents are moving towards their children so they can provide for the grandchildren. But children are also moving in the direction of their parents, or moving in with each other so that they can provide care, because this responsibility, or this felt responsibility that we have to do something for our parents, or parents want to continue to parent, and that's why they're involved in grandchildren, is very strong. And what we haven't been looking at yet, but it was mentioned somewhere, I think also by Kimberly, is that we have to start looking at new policies enabling this temporary visiting, or this temporary leaving to go back to China to take care of mom, or to have mummy come into Toronto or into Amsterdam to take care of the children. And that's something that is currently being addressed, at least in Canada, quite strongly. Not in the United States, and is starting to emerge on the European policy agenda. I think I'll stick with it right now.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for the comments. So I guess I should just say, maybe this kind of addresses both Myra's and Mary's comment to some degree, that my remarks, I guess, were less about the sort of pure feminist vision of how I would love the world to be if I could wave a wand and create my utopia, and much more a reaction to, this is the world we live in, this is the reality, and the reality, I think, is very hard to change. And so while changing the global division of labor would be, one can hope for this. I participated in one of Eric Olin Wright's Real Utopias conference, in which we talked about waving that magic wand and having everything the way we want it. But I think when one looks at the realities of the structure of the international economy, then one is left with trying to figure out how to make the best of what there is. I think, as Pearl was saying, the reality, for many people, and this goes back to the guest worker era, men left their countries to earn income that flowed back then to the countries where they left. And it's the exact same reason people are continuing to migrate today, why women are migrating temporarily and why men are continuing to migrate temporarily, and then sometimes they stay. So with regard then to the question of, whether the solutions I was offering were sort of narrowly national, I was talking about national policies. I do think that the EU and the OECD have been, and the ILO, the UN, there are lots of international organizations that talk about the need to act in these areas as well, and I certainly wouldn't exclude those kinds of solutions. But in thinking about the sort of international, I think what you were getting at, Mary, was more the sort of global division of of labor, and isn't that the core problem? And I agree, but my remarks were more pitched at, given that, how should states be responding? Should they do as they did in the post-45 period and sort of pretend that these laborers are just going to go home and we don't really have responsibility for them, and let's just sort of let it all unfold as it does? And I think that's what states are now doing. I think it's what Southern European countries have done with regard to this labor. I think it's what the UK has done with regard to all the labor that's come in. That instead of actually trying to craft a coherent sort of forward-looking and humane policy, the response has been to sort of say, well, let it happen as it does, and, well, hopefully a lot of them will leave and we won't have to think about this. And I think states should think about this and actually try to craft a policy. And in so doing, I totally agree with your second point that it's not just about the low-wage migrant worker. It's low-wage care work as a whole, or all the whole household sector. I've written about that. It's something that, from the U.S. standpoint, is just abominable. And going back to my own child care center, I'm just continually horrified at the low wages and poor working conditions of the child care workforce in this country. And I see that developing in Western Europe and certainly in the UK. It's a huge issue. And so I do think it is much broader, and this maybe gets to Myra's point, treating it in a broader sense of how can we upskill, how can we sort of improve that whole sector of low-wage labor and care work as a whole. Maybe it's more saleable to say, let's do this for everybody than let's just do this for immigrants, because that's probably not a sort of a politically good way to go. But I think, Myra, your points about the care drain is something so many people have written about. And I guess I'm a little bit more, I'm sort of interested in your remarks, Pearl, about how, it actually, when the resources flow back into these countries, there's often improvements in people's standard of living and in the situation of children. Because I sort of feel like this migration will happen anyway. People are always on the move for better circumstances, and until the standard of living rises in so many countries, people will continue to leave. There's some interesting evidence coming out of with regard to Mexican immigration to the United States during the economic crisis, how many people went back to Mexico. And there have been arguments in the immigration literature about how there's just not as many people from Mexico wanting to come to the United States because actually the quality of the standard of living has been rising, and so people are able to have better lives there rather than have to move. But I think your point about the risk of a racialized politics is very real, and we're seeing it unfolding in a number of European countries where economics and ethnicity overlay each other, and you get this sort of racialized inequality and then a really ugly politics around that. But I guess it's why I would say, left parties need to take the bull by the horns and fight that and stand up for something. I mean, I'm kind of watching the European left just disintegrate in so many countries and not seem to stand for anything. And I would wish that they could stand at least for this, for trying to help invest in these populations and invest in their populations as a whole. But that's again the sort of more unrealistic view, perhaps.
Mary, you asked about the gender equality and the fertility and what it tells about the Scandinavian countries if the low-income people don't have the chance to have children anymore. First of all, I have to say it's minimal still. Yeah. So you have highly educated have maybe a completed cohort fertility that has at the age of 45, they might have 1.9 or 2, and the low educated have 1.7. So the difference is very low compared to, for example, the Germany or so, where the highly educated have 24. You don't have half a child difference between them. So what I wanted to point out that there is a change going on or coming about is that many of the policies that we have implemented over the past couple of years were to promote childbearing among the highly educated. For example, the German discourse on the change from 3 years parental leave with flat rate to was a discourse the highly educated and therefore the more valuable people, they didn't say it so clearly, but that was it, have fewer children, while the poor ones, where the children don't have such a good upbringing or whatever, they have a lot of children. So it was taxing highly educated as being the more valuable, and they have fewer children than the low income, low educated people, and they have too many. It's a racial discourse on a class level that was there. That was Germany. Yes. Yeah. In the I think what I wanted to point out that most of our policies that we have had over the last couple of years were focusing on the highly educated, and that we should have policies that get the highly educated to have children.
Also in Sweden. Also in
Sweden, not that much. No, because it didn't have such a policy discourse. While there is something going on, especially in the Nordic countries where parental leave is income dependent, that you see that the low income people are not going to have children. And of course one can critique that and say, do we bring fertility closer to economic aspects as we have had so far? Is this really something that we should do? But on the other hand, we could say, is there a new danger coming up where more investment in children is needed, and so that those who do not have the possibility to invest into those children abstain from having children? You know what I mean? It's a class discourse that is behind it, where children are only, and having children is only kind of a signal of something that is going on. Are you not, do I not understand you?
I don't want to take up too much time, but I'm just surprised that you're making those points about Sweden, because I would have thought that, and I completely agree about the German policy, that it is a policy for upper class.
Yes.
But I would have thought Sweden is a country that actually kind of covers the cost of having children, particularly
still so income dependent.
I'm just a bit surprised that it's a policy that penalizes childbearing among the low-income sector. I've never heard it represented as such, and I'm just interested in.
I don't,
No,
I don't think the
penalizes but doesn't support sufficiently to overcome the cost.
you cannot. Yeah, my point behind that is that the, you cannot do it with exactly as Myra said, that the family policies and the cannot substitute for an income and an employment. The main source of welfare is still employment and the income that you get through your employment.
But I would never have thought otherwise. I mean, but if that's really something that women have to provide now, if families
Yes.
are really dependent on women and men's incomes, then family policy that's only partly able to make up the gap
Yes.
for women is in fact saying the more that you depend on women's income, the less able that family policy is to overcome that. You would have to have a family policy that was actively tilted towards encouraging low, if you really wanted to change the birth rate, is how I understand what Gerda is saying. If policymakers really just wanted to have more Swedish kids or more German kids of any class, then you would target the supports to the lowest income families, where you could in fact most closely come to meeting 100% of their income needs. They would then start having children at the same rate as more advantaged women who can afford to take some time.
Not quite. I don't think that this can substitute for income that you get on the labor market. And so what we see is this kind of cleavages that part-time work also means part income. And part-time work might be fine for people who have a sufficient income and then reduced by a few hours. But it's not sufficient for people who have a low income in full-time work. So it's having a kind of a policy that targets employment and labor market and these kind of areas in the labor market where there is really low income. And I don't know how to do that because of this kind of globalization to bring in that word. But that would be the real point. You cannot substitute through welfare benefits what is lost by in the labor market.
If I can follow, just trying to sort this out in my own head. But that would be, in fact, saying something close to what Kimberly was saying, too, is that a policy directed at raising the wages of low-wage women for full-time work would, in fact, both raise the birth rate and improve the situation of the migrant women who are often the people doing that work. And that's where I see also the issue of the racialization of that low-wage labor market as being a real obstacle to trying to raise the wages. Are those really Swedish kids who will be born, or are they Somali Swedes? Are they really Germans, or are they Turkish Germans?
I have a naive question about this, which is, it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the countries that have wage replacement parental leave, it's based on the wages you were earning before you had the baby, which means rich people get paid more to do childcare than poor people, and they get paid more to do childcare than childcare workers who are not rich people, right? So isn't this kind of regressive, and is there any thought that one opportunity for progressivity would be to rectify that?
The principle is based on the same principle as sick pay.
Right.
That is, why should sick pay be linked to your actual wages and maternity and parental benefits not?
I think also that men would never, I mean, that's one of the logics for the Swedish one anyway, is that if you had the higher replacement rate, you might at least get some men who take it, right? But because men make more than women, and so if you're only paying at the lower level, then you guarantee that women.
So
are
a man
always
with
the one
very
taking-
low childcare skill, just speaking hypothetically, gets paid like 10 times more than a skilled professional childcare worker who's been doing it her whole life.
Well, but he's learning to be a father.
Oh. Nothing is more important than a parent's love, apparently. Anyway, sorry, but we should let Chiara.
I go back to your question, if I understood it correctly, that is with the fact that these foreign care workers enter into the intimacy of the individuals and the family. This changes the idea about migrant workers. Is that the question? Well, from the point of view of the Italian case, I would say yes, but only for them. That is, in all the periodic regularization we had, that is, we have all this influx of irregular migrants, and once in a while we do a big regularization. This is the way we proceed, also probably because we cannot do nothing else, but much else different. But this is how it happens. And particularly, in the last two, care workers, badanti. Another thing that in the international literature you use the terrible Italian word badanti, and which is really terrible. The badanti were an exception, or were a privileged category to be regularized. Even in the very last one, which was made by the right government, the last Berlusconi government, which was really vicious in its approach, they had a special exception for the badanti. The only one who could be regularized instead of becoming clandestine were the badanti. So we had suddenly we had many men who had been badanti. Because we are very full of fantasy in Italy. So, but I remember I wrote a piece for a newspaper. I said, why are the badanti more deserving than the brick workers, the building, the construction workers? So why that? So they are both needed, but because there was a push by the families who hired them, the Catholic Church who said, oh, and also the state was happy because the families are going to pay for it. So it was at no cost. They are not providing the services, and all the regularization was at the cost of the families. So, okay. Thinking of the care drain, I just want...
It's 5 o'clock, so we got to...
Okay. Yes.
I know I cut you off. You're the only one I cut off last time, too. So.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
You are cutting only me.
I know. It's an
It's
accident of
age
scheduling. I'm
I know, it's
sorry.
age discrimination. Okay, no, nothing. I don't think that the concept of intergenerational regime is wrong. I mean, the idea is there such a thing as an intergenerational regime? And the answer is no. And I think it's not because the concept is wrong, but because the concept probably of regime is wrong, or the way regimes have been constructed are being constructed on very few items, and all linked to the labor market and to workers. And as soon as you enlarge it, I mean, we did not discover anything new. Jens Albert has written that if you put services in it, everything breaks down. So what I was trying to say, can we see a logic? And also we explained why we could not, because there are different history, different bodies, and different authorities in the different fields. And so, but it's interesting to see that if you look at policies and not only to the standard workers' policy and try to figure whether there is a logic unifying clustering countries, you do not find it. And I think it's a good result. It's not that the concept is wrong. So we can find an intergenerational regime at an individual. Then, yes, you can see countries going together more than others, but there is not such a thing as I want to explain. I said from the beginning, defamiliation through the market is the outcome of familiarization by default. So it's okay, it's a possible outcome, but it is totally different from giving you money, as in the Finnish case, or to stay, or in the German case, if you do not send the child to child care, now you receive the Elterngeld, because that is supported familiarization. I give you money to stay home to do that. But while through the market, it could be subsidized. It could, but in most cases, it's not. And I agree that the market is expanding. It's expanding not only because the welfare state is retrenching, but because needs are growing, because women are in the labor force, and also because what I showed with the first figure, I mean, the caring balance has become unbalanced, particularly the upward obligation. I mean, even in the past, children and parents, not all children lived near their parents, but there was always one, at least, living nearby. Now, if you have only one child and that one goes away, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So that is, it's not that only the behavior of people has changed, but the demographic balance has totally changed.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the panel. Let's give them another round. Thank you. They didn't think we could have a 3-hour panel, but we did our best.